What happens when healing turns to heresy? When the woman who saved lives is accused of stealing souls. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the true story of Jeanne Becquet, a healer from 14th century Toulouse, a woman whose knowledge of herbs, dreams, and wounds made her beloved and then condemned her to the flames. A victim of paranoia, power, and piety, Jeanne wasn't just executed. She was unmade. What you're about to hear is not just a tale of witchcraft, it's a glimpse into the dark machinery of the medieval church and how it learned to turn women into fuel. Toulouse, 1320s. A city wrapped in incense and whispers. At the edge of the city walls, where the cobbled streets gave way to wild herbs and forgotten shrines, lived a woman named Jeanne Becquet. She wasn't born noble. She wasn't taught in any university. But she knew things. Things about fevers and childbirth, about bleeding and bones, about how to speak to a dying man so that he would close his eyes without fear. She was called wise woman by some, witch by others. And for most of her early life, she walked the knife edge between reverence and suspicion. But Jeanne had something the church couldn't explain. Power. The kind of power that didn't come from relics or prayers, but from bitter roots, whispered incantations, and results. In the villages beyond Toulouse, when a child grew cold with sickness, parents didn't call a priest. They called Jeanne. And often, too often, the child lived. But healing can be dangerous, not just for the illness it defies, but for the systems it threatens. By 1330, the Inquisition had begun tightening its grip across southern France. The memory of the Cathars, the heretical sect burned out just decades earlier, still haunted the church like smoke. And where there's smoke, there must be witches. It started with whispers. That Jeanne knew too much. That she didn't pray enough. That she sold powders and salves but refused to quote scripture. Then came the incident at Ruse, a noble's wife, struck down by plague, who recovered after Jeanne's intervention. But the priest had already performed last rites. Her survival, he said, was unnatural. And in a world where the church claimed authority over life and death, Jeanne's existence was an insult to God. In the spring of 1331, a knock came to Jeanne's door. 3 men, draped in black, carrying scrolls sealed with crimson wax. The Inquisition didn't come with swords. They came with silence. With accusations, not evidence. With parchment, not justice. Jeanne was taken to the convent of the Black Sisters, a place known not for prayers but for its cold stone cells and quieter screams. There, under torchlight and threat, began what the church called interrogatio animarum, the interrogation of the soul. They asked her about herbs, about her dreams, about the names of spirits she might have called. When she refused to answer, they showed her the rack. When she cried out that she was only a healer, they asked who had taught her to bind bones. When she answered, "My mother," they asked when her mother had made her first pact with the devil. And just like that, Jeanne's trial had begun, not in court, but in the mind of her accusers. The Inquisition didn't need facts. It needed confessions. And in a time when truth could be pulled from a body with ropes and blades, Jeanne soon gave them what they wanted. She confessed to speaking with a dark man in dreams. She confessed to gathering herbs under a blood moon. She confessed to knowing the names of fallen angels, names she'd never heard before the inquisitors whispered them. They recorded it all with elegant handwriting. And then they sealed her fate with wax. Jeanne's name was entered into the Liber Nigra, the Black Book, a register of souls condemned by the church. And though her bones ached and her voice broke, she still spoke the words, "I never served the devil. I served the sick." But those words were no longer hers to defend. On the morning of June 17, 1331, the people of Toulouse were summoned. Not by trumpet, but by bell. A long, droning toll that told every cobbler, baker, and noble that justice would be done. That a witch, a real one, would burn today. Jeanne was brought forth in a simple robe. No crown of iron. No gag. Just rope. And as she stood before the pyre, she looked not at the sky, but at the crowd. And she said, You will remember me as a witch. But your children will remember me as something else. Then the fire began to eat. The fire that consumed Jean Becquet left no remains. No ashes were collected. No relics were preserved. The Inquisition didn't make martyrs. It erased them. But fire cannot burn whispers. For weeks after her death, the marketplace of Toulouse fell quiet. The women who once traded poultices and tinctures now sold bread and kept their heads low. The children who used to run through the city's alleys now stayed close to home. Because the message had been clear. To know too much was to die too soon. But even in silence, something stirred. It began with a song. A lullaby, really. Sung by old women to crying babies. Bone binder, soul seeker. Burned by fire, healed the weaker. No one admitted where it came from. But suddenly, the name Jean was everywhere. In alleyway chalk, in whispers before sleep, in stories traded like coins. She became something else. Not quite saint. Not quite devil. A symbol of the price of knowledge. They said she could walk in dreams. That if you left a sprig of rosemary under your pillow, she would come. That sick children sometimes murmured her name before they got better. Even the clergy noticed. A Franciscan friar wrote in his diary, "The fire consumed the flesh, but the spirit walks. We did not destroy her. We made her echo." Brother Arnaud de Castelnau, the man who oversaw Jean's interrogation, began to doubt. Not openly, not in sermons. But in the quiet hours of night, his quill trembled. He wrote, "She knew no scripture. But she spoke with mercy. She named no demon. But she knew the names of roots." The church had ordered the record sealed, but Arnaud kept one page, her final testimony, hidden behind a brick in the convent's wall. In it she had said, "If I am a witch, then the wind is a liar. For it taught me nothing but how to smell rain before it came." Arnaud would read that page again and again, as though it might confess for him. But the guilt remained unconfessed, and the page remained hidden. In 1348, the Black Death reached Toulouse. It came on rats, on ships, on the breath of strangers. And suddenly, the church had no answers. Prayers failed. Pilgrimages fell. The sick died fast and screaming. In desperation, people turned not to priests, but to memory. They remembered Jean. They remembered her bitter teas, her strange charms, her songs to the fevered. And they began to imitate her. They broke into gardens and collected the herbs she once used. They whispered her name over boiling pots. And somehow, some survived. The Inquisition called it blasphemy. The people called it hope. By 1350, Jean Becquet had become too dangerous, not in body, but in legacy. The Bishop of Toulouse issued a decree. Anyone speaking the witch's name shall be excommunicated. Her name was chiseled off the prison records. The convent where she was held was demolished. All herbalists within the city were forced to register with the church and swear oaths of loyalty. But history has a habit of growing back, like a root not fully dug out. A century later, a chronicler named Étienne Louvet, writing about the plague years, would stumble upon a poem written in the margins of a medical text. She burned but healed. She died but taught. Let the church bury bones, but it cannot burn thought. And there it was, the ghost of Jean Becquet, written in the corners where ink was meant to fade. By early March of 1321, the town of Toulouse seemed gripped by a terrible fever. The tribunal's sessions grew longer. More names were whispered in darkened hallways. People disappeared from their homes, only to be seen again in chains or not at all. Confessions echoed from the dungeon walls, some genuine, most broken from torture, others carefully staged to feed the fire that the inquisitors had already lit in their minds. Jean Beauquier's name appeared in multiple testimonies, not just as an accused but as a central figure in a supposed cult of witches tied to diabolical rites beneath the city. Some claimed she consorted with demons in the cemetery after midnight, dancing nude under the moon, invoking names forbidden even to speak. Others said she brewed poisons and charms that could unmake a man's will or kill with a kiss. The inquisitors believed they had found more than a heretic. They believed they had uncovered a queen of witches, a priestess of shadow who seduced the faithful and poisoned the land. Her trial began not in a courtroom but within the inner sanctum of the Dominican monastery, closed to the public. She was chained at wrists and ankles, barely able to move. Her garments, already torn from repeated inspections for the witch's mark, hung loosely from her gaunt frame. Jean refused to confess. Her voice, hoarse, tired, but still defiant, resisted every accusation. She admitted to healing. She admitted to knowing the properties of plants and waters. But no demons, no Sabbaths, no curses. Yet the inquisitors needed a witch. And so the torture resumed. On the rack she screamed. Under the press, she cried out for mercy. When forced to wear boots filled with boiling water, she fainted. But no words of guilt left her lips. What they could not extract in truth, they shaped through fabrication. Witnesses were planted. Scrolls were written. A shadow play unfolded, where truth bent to necessity. Finally, on a storm-choked morning in May, Jean Beauquier was paraded through the streets of Toulouse in a cart of straw. Her hair had been shorn. Her feet were bloodied from shackles. A placard hung around her neck: heretic, sorceress, servant of the devil. Crowds gathered, not just from fear or hatred, but fascination. They watched her pass in silence, some crossing themselves, others spitting. But few truly understood what they were seeing. This was no trial. It was a spectacle, a cleansing by fire. As she stood tied to the stake outside the Saint-Cernin gates, the inquisitor offered her a final chance to confess. She raised her eyes to the heavens and said nothing. The flames took her before the sun could break through the clouds. And yet her death did not bring peace. As the summer of 1321 bled into autumn, the mood in Toulouse darkened further. The Inquisition, with the support of both church and crown, had reached the crescendo of its efforts. What had begun as a localized inquiry had become a full-blown theater of fear, with public spectacles of confession and condemnation used to reinforce authority. Jean Beauquier, now emaciated and visibly broken from months of isolation and torment, was brought before the public one final time. The square was full, nobles, merchants, peasants, all drawn to the fire promised for the day. Some came out of piety, some for spectacle, some merely to survive by showing they stood with the church. The inquisitors recited her crimes in slow, deliberate tones. The list was grotesque and theatrical: midnight rituals, infant sacrifices, love potions brewed from blood and bone. Much of it invented, drawn from the darkest corners of the inquisitorial handbook, and shaped by local gossip and fear. Jean barely responded. Her silence was interpreted as confirmation. There was no appeal, no defense. The tribunal had already written the ending. She was stripped of any final dignity and paraded through the streets. Town criers announced her fate, and holy men followed with chants meant to cleanse the path of her presence. Her eyes scanned the crowd, perhaps seeking sympathy, or perhaps wondering how many there had once called on her for healing, for midwifery, for help in childbirth. At the stake, surrounded by bundles of dry wood and pitch, Jean stood silent as the fire was lit. Witnesses claimed she whispered a final prayer. Some said to God, others swore it was to darker forces. Either way, her death was slow and public. A brutal lesson burned into the city's collective memory. But her execution didn't end the hysteria. If anything, it fanned it. Toulouse saw an increase in denunciations in the years that followed. Women healers, herbalists, midwives, anyone who straddled the line between tradition and medicine, found themselves suspect. The Inquisition had discovered a new weapon: fear of the feminine unknown. Jean's story, buried for centuries, lived on in whispers. Some claimed her ghost haunted the narrow alleys of the city. Others believed her spirit had cursed her accusers. But among the women of the Midi, her name became something else: an unspoken martyr, a silent reminder of the cost of being different in a world ruled by dogma and dread. It would take centuries for her name to be spoken without venom. Only in the modern age, through rediscovered documents and the reevaluation of Inquisition records, did the truth begin to emerge. She was not a witch. She was a woman. And that had been her greatest crime.